Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ROM. My name is Fahmida Suleiman, and I am the Senior Curator of ROM's Islamic World Collections, and I'm delighted you could join us for today's digital program. We at ROM acknowledge that we sit on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who have been the original stewards of the land since time immemorial to today. Today's program explores the art of deaf Canadian contemporary artist Maryam Hafizirad, whose work fuses her Persian and deaf identities through deaf view image art, the art movement known as Devia. This program is being hosted with the assistance of an American Sign Language interpreter. That's Kate Lewis on the screen. And captions are also available for those who prefer to use them. Your screen is set to show all the video participants, including the interpreter. And once the presentation is on screen, you are able to adjust the size of the video and slide it on your screen. So that you can have bigger images of Kate and Maryam. If you are having any trouble with this, please indicate it in the chat and my colleague Erin will assist you. I encourage you to submit your questions and thoughts via the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen during the program. Don't wait until the end, and we will do our best to address them during the program. I would like to invite my guest, Maryam Hafizirad, to the screen. Maryam Hafizirad.
Thanks so much for having me, Fahmida.
Maryam Hafizirad is an award-winning deaf Canadian Persian painter and sculptor. Her work has been shown in Iran, China, Germany, Malaysia, India, and Canada. She is also an art curator at the Deaf Cultural Center and on the faculty of the Deaf Arts Academy and the Canadian Cultural Society of the Deaf. A graduate of Isfahan University of Fine Arts in Iran, she has lived and worked in Iran, Malaysia, and now Canada. So we welcome you, Maryam, to the program.
Thank you so much, Fahmida, for that introduction.
Maryam, could you please share your presentation with us on the screen?
Oh, certainly.
Wonderful. Okay, I think we can all see that now. Just another comment to the audience. You can use the little slide button next to Maryam's presentation to increase the size of the speakers if you wish. Okay, so Maryam, let's launch into our first question. Can you start by explaining what the Devia movement is all about and the critical role that American deaf artist Betty Miller and other deaf artists played in the establishment of the movement for us?
I'd be happy to. I want to do a basic introduction for the audience of what the Devia movement is. It's a rich history and there's a lot to say, but I'm just going to give you a brief introduction. Devia stands for Deaf View Image Art, and it's commonly known as Devia. It's a deaf experience expressed through an artistic medium. There are many elements which are part of this legacy of artistic practice. There is representations of deaf experience and deaf history through metaphor, through various motifs that are commonly represented in Devia. There's deaf experiential insights and perspectives on the world that are conveyed through artistic practices. And these are some of the elements that Devia represents. There's a strong use of contrasting color, strong textural use, as well as values. There are an emphasis on facial features such as eyes, mouth, and ears, and also the hands. It originated with a manifesto, Betty Miller, as you said, and a colleague who hosted a workshop and began to explore the ideas that eventually became Devia. It was in May of 1989, and a workshop was held at Gallaudet University. And over the course of 4 days, the manifesto was hammered out by the artists who were present. And we call Betty Miller the mother of Devia for her instrumental work in bringing it into being at that originating workshop in Gallaudet. Now, I'm mentioning Gallaudet. You may not be familiar with it. It is the first and only deaf university in the world in Washington, D.C. So Betty and Paul Johnston were the two people who really hosted this workshop, but they included and invited 9 other artists to be part of this visioning process. I want to make a clear distinction between Devia and deaf art and deaf artists. Deaf people can be artists in any medium, make in any genre, and make art and be held to the same standards of any artist. But Devia is unique in that it's these deaf artists or these artists who are conveying a deaf experience. And Devia is typically divided into these 3 categories of themes: resistance, affirmation, and liberation. Resistance often focuses on some of the restrictive, negative experiences of deaf people. Autism, which may be a word that you're not familiar with, but it describes the oppression of deaf people and the presumption that being hearing and hearingness is preferable and superior to being deaf. So that's a theme that comes up a lot in the theme of resistance, a loss of identity. This particular image is entitled The Family Dog, and it's an acrylic on canvas by Susan Dupour, one of the most powerful images. Here you can see a young deaf girl who is on the floor under a table. This is a typical experience of deaf people. You can see her surrounded by her hearing family members with their arms crossed, representing the dogmatic absence of sign language. Their faces are blurred because their spoken language is inaccessible to this deaf child, who is on the floor being fed scraps of information, like scraps of food falling from the table. She's unable to access the conversation and communication around her by these family's members whose faces are blurred and obscured, representing the absence of communication and her isolation. This is a work from a photographer, Tristan Kong. It's entitled My Deaf Life, and you can see the woman sitting at the table. And behind her in the background is a board with the text, "I feel invisible when I eat dinner because with my family because no one communicates with me." And you can see the table is set for 3, but she's the only one there, which represents the fact that when she is with her family, she is essentially alone. And this represents the dinner table syndrome, which is a very common experience by deaf people who come from hearing families, during which time they're celebrating or eating a meal or sharing a meal, and yet they are essentially alone and isolated. The next image that I'd like to show is called Fifth Grade by the artist Nancy Rourke. And you can see the strong use of contrasting colors here. And the image of the person in the front is a deaf person, a young deaf child with strong, vibrant, contrasting colors. She has earphones on. This signifies the preoccupation with oral and spoken language. And she is surrounded by her classmates in black and white with whom she has no connection. So this is a depiction of the trauma, educational trauma experienced by many deaf people. Nancy's work is at the Deaf Cultural Center being shown right now. So if you're interested in seeing more of that, please do come by. The next theme, which is often explored in Devia, is affirmation. These are images of pride, of celebration, of deafhood. These are positive images celebrating the deaf experience. This is a work entitled My Eye by Harry Williams. You can see the large image of the eye. Again, facial features such as eyes and mouths are often depicted in Devia, but and in addition to the eye, we have a hand, which is also strongly present in many Devia pieces of work. And behind the eye, we have a musical staff and musical notes, which again celebrates the musicality of visual in deaf experience. This particular artwork is shown, it's the door handles of the main doors going into the Deaf Culture Center where it used to be in its previous location. And this is just to show that Devia is not limited to fine arts of painting. It can also be in costume, in fashion, in architecture, anywhere where deaf experience is conveyed in an artistic medium, that is Devia. This particular piece is taken from the sign for Inspire, and this is work that was done by an artist, and it is taken from the sign for Inspire, and I'll show you how it was done. The sign was being produced while the signer had motion capture on her hands and produced the sign. The motion capture transposed it into an image, which then was sculpted into the door handles that we saw earlier. The next theme that is often explored in Devia is the theme of liberation. And works that explore this theme are looking at the liberatory possibilities in deaf experience. This is a piece called Deaf Identity Crayons by Anne Silver. The first piece looks at a box of crayons that the labels of which come from the labels that deaf people have been called by hearing people in the past, historically. Dummy, lip reader, deaf and dumb, hearing impaired. All of these labels that have been put onto deaf people. And in contrast, we see the deaf identity. This is a piece in 1999 that was done. And these have labels such as CODA, which you may not be familiar with, but it is a short form for child of deaf adult, and that's an experience that's part of the deaf identity. Also seeing, deaf blind, late deafened, deaf American, signer. These are labels that deaf people use to identify themselves. So again, it's an active resistance and reclamation of self-identifying as deaf. This is an image from The Black Drum, which was a deaf musical. I was part of the creative team in this production. Again, we see strong use of contrasting colors, the sort of dark, bleak aspects transitioning into the bright celebratory colors. This is at the dancer who's representing a butterfly. Maybe you don't know, but butterflies are deaf, and so they have come to symbolize deaf joy in the deaf community and a celebration of being deaf. And so I use this in my artwork. As you can see here, this fish has many of the colors of celebration, and those colors were echoed in the dye that I used on the costume of this dancer. In this image, this was from one of my deaf students at the Deaf Academy of Arts. Again, a really good image, an example of liberation. In the bottom, you see these lips, dark monochromatic colors, voiceless lips, and the expressive hands signing the sign for oppression and the reclamation, the release of that oppression. And in that reclamation, through that expression, you see the release of this flock of butterflies with, again, bright colors, contrasting colors. So I hope that that's clear, my description of those images.
Thank you, Maryam, for such a wonderful presentation for us on, we have a better understanding now of what is Divya. And some of those images were just very beautiful and powerful at the same time. I want to now shift more to your personal artistic practice. And could you share with us perhaps what was your art like in Iran in the early days? I think this is the pre-Divya period for you. And what was it like growing up as a deaf artist in Iran?
Certainly. I'll show you some of the images that I produced while I lived in Iran. I grew up in Iran and I received my BA from the university there. And a lot of what I experienced had to do with my identity as a deaf woman. This particular image is entitled The Box, and it explores the experience of a deaf person being viewed by hearing society, by their hearing family. And those views were often very negative. They were very limiting. They were very constraining. Here we have an image of a woman who's in a box, essentially coffin-like. You can see there is a mark on the forehead. It's called the bote in Persian culture. It represents the spirit. And I also really represent women. Women are often objectified and diminished in Persian culture. It's a very patriarchal culture. So a lot of my work in the early days was really around raising women's status through artistic expression. You can see there is the fish, an embryo of a fish in her womb. I think that that's really, again, almost instinctively drawing on symbols of Divya and deaf celebration without even knowing it at the time. So these are experiences of women who are oppressed, who are diminished, and yet somewhere in this fish, a representation of hope. This one is called The Guiding Eye. I want to talk a little bit about my use of fish as a motif. I identify fish as representations of deaf experience, and they're underwater. Their silence is beautiful. There's no possibility of speech underwater. It's a visual world in which sign language is supreme because it's communicative. You can communicate in sign language underwater in a way which spoken language is impossible. And so the body of the fish here, you can see there's a lot of texture that is to represent suffering, trauma, and pain. You can see a lot of smaller fish. These are the fish who are still finding their way into community. Many deaf women in Iran become very isolated. They're not permitted to engage socially. They can't socialize without not being in the presence of their husband. It's a strong patriarchal society. And so isolation is a real theme in some of the work that I did in those early days. I want to talk a little about my very last exhibition in Iran. And a lot of my early work was looking at women's bodies and representations and depictions of women's bodies, which is something which was very much not permitted, not celebrated in Iran. And so these depictions were taboo in many aspects of life. Women were not permitted to travel without their husbands. They're not permitted to do certain things in public. They're not permitted to socialize. There are many things which are not available to women in general. And you think about how much that oppression is compounded for deaf women. And so these were some of the things that I was looking at in my early work. There was a beautiful moment when I set up this exhibition. Many of my deaf friends came. People were very much excited to come to the moment, to come to a moment where they're able to come together and share. But unfortunately, my work had to be taken down and was not able to be shown for 5 years because of the nature of the motifs and depictions that I had in my work. So this is just an image of me in Iran, where I was doing some sketching and some work. Pardon me for the interpreter. This is when I moved to Malaysia, and this was an image taken from me in Malaysia.
Okay, so actually, that's a great segue to my next question. So in 2008, you and your husband decided to move to Malaysia. Now, why did you decide to leave Iran? And can you tell us how your artistic practice developed in Malaysia?
Mm-hmm. I picked Malaysia because I was able to travel there without a visa. And I was able to, it was more liberating in Malaysia compared to Iran. It was a very difficult decision to leave my homeland for sure, but I do want to show about some images that reveal some of the changes that happened in my art practice with this move. You can see in my early work, it's quite monochromatic with a strong use of texture. And then as I moved to Malaysia, you can see here I was actually painting on the floor. I didn't have a lot of space or studio space, but I hadn't yet explored my deaf identity. I was really in Iran, I was very much focused on my experience as a woman, but in Malaysia, I was able to do things that I hadn't as a woman been able to do in Iran, being out, being social, going out for bike rides. And some of that liberation and freedom was revealed in my paintings through the use of color and form. This is an image of a woman who is performing on a daf, a Persian instrument. The rhythm of the daf, it sometimes is used, it conveys the sort of bird song, the light melodic song. But this woman, you don't see very much of her features, but you do see her breasts portrayed. And that is a very liberatory move in my art. And you can see many of the motifs that are present on her dress. I wish I could explore the metaphors of all of these. I don't have time, but you can just see overall a really significant change in the art compared to what I was producing in Iran. Here again, the use of fish. I keep coming back to fish. It's a very powerful metaphor. And also, again, women's bodies, depictions of women's bodies are very strong in this. So here, these two things are coming together. Also, you can see many of the stamps that I've used. That's a strong Persian motif. And that is repeated in this as a motif. So fish, women's bodies, eyes, those are all motifs that recur in this time of my practice. This was the last painting I did while I was in Malaysia, and it's called Dream of Flying. Birds are very strong traditional motifs in Persian culture. It's the representations of love, and you can see those are stamped on repeated ways in this image. And so, and instead of the bird flying in this, it's me who's actually flying and released. So images of freedom and love. In this piece also, again, I still had not been exposed to Devia at all. And yet some of the elements that are common in Devia are emerging in my work at this time as though they were instinctive to me as a deaf person. So that was Malaysia.
That was Malaysia, and thank you. Your artwork in Malaysia it's absolutely gorgeous. It's uplifting. I'm sure people will agree with me in the audience. Okay, immigration to Canada. So in 2011, you received your Canadian visas and you migrated as a couple to Toronto. Lucky us. This is where you are first introduced to Devia. What changed for you here in Toronto? And can you whisk us through the new developments in your projects in Canada over the past 14 years? Audience, I'm mindful of time. And I just want to ensure that we leave room for your Q&A. So I urge you to continue to type in your questions and we will get to them as soon as possible. Take it away, Maryam.
Sure. I'll talk a little bit about moving to Canada. This was my first exhibition on Queen's Gallery in 2011. It was a really precious moment to me. Pardon me. I moved to Canada and experienced tremendous culture shock. This was where I encountered a deaf identity, deaf culture, deaf history for the first time, deaf community. For the first time, I met people at the Deaf Culture Center, Joanne Cripps and Anita Hall, who are at the Deaf Culture Center, and exposed me to this practice of Devia for the very first time. I immersed myself in the deaf world, and my artistic practice begins to reveal very strongly a deaf identity. This piece is entitled Eyes Must Be Washed. It was a 2016 piece, and the quote there is by Sohrab Sapari, and it's, you know, one of my favorite poets, very expressive. And to me, this quote is, it helps us to understand how the impact of the ways that people depict us as being broken is so damaging. So this piece has our two sets of three portraits separated by a wooden table with a basin of water in it. And the first set of portraits are three deaf people who I interviewed, and then overlaid over their portraits some of the ways that they described having been labeled by hearing people in their lives. Can't breathe, broken ear, not a whole person. You can see one of those portraits has a very exaggerated ear because that comes from the medicalized idea, a preoccupation with deaf people's ears as being broken. And that's an experience that many, many deaf people can share. And then in the middle of the room, there is a video being projected, and I'll show it to you here. Water is purifying. Wash your eyes and you will be able to see things differently. Which brings us to the second set of these three deaf people's portraits that show them vibrant, successful, expressive, nourished, flourishing. These are the image of the bird, the firebird rising. And these are images that are overlaid on these deaf people of uplifting, positive life experience. This piece is called Unmasked. There are, I think, 46, I can't remember exactly, it's quite large, 46 images of both deaf and hearing people that are mounted. And you can see the pictures. Some of them, they say, "Open me" on them. And the audience is invited to guess, to tell, to wonder if they are able to identify who in this gallery is deaf or hearing, which of these pictures are deaf and which are hearing. And it's to challenge people's assumptions about what it is to be deaf. Instead of reaching out with pity or, feeling sorry for, they're invited to see celebrations of positive representations of deaf experience. So they're invited to actually open the images, open these little boxes on the wall. In this one and others, they will find golden ears. And this is because many people might assume that this person was deaf, but they're not. In fact, this person is hearing, and that's represented by the golden ears, the gold depicting the great value that people place on hearing and sound. Here's another person. Are they deaf? Are they hearing? Can you tell? What do you presume? What do you assume about them when you open it up? This is the dancer, actually, that I showed in an earlier image in the brightly colored dress, who was dancing in the black drum. Many people assume deaf people can't dance, and this is an image celebrating her musical and choreographic expertise. So there are many of these, and each of them open, celebrating a different aspect of their deaf experience and deaf identity. This is called The Story of My World. And I'm very proud of myself as a deaf person. I think that as deaf people, we struggle in many ways, but we also celebrate and we also excel. And one of the ways that we do that is through language. I see sign language as being a beautiful language that's vibrant and rich and colorful. And that some of those colors come out in my representations of these hands in ceramic. So again, as the hearing people were represented by the gold ears in the previous work, in this work, I have gold glaze on the fingers of the ceramic to represent and symbolize the beauty, the richness, and the vibrancy. Just before we started the webinar, Famina, I was teaching you the sign for excited. That image of the hand right at the front, the blue one with the gold finger coming down, that's the hand shape that's used in the sign that we were talking about before. That's right. And this one's called The Mother of Davia, Seeds from Within. And this comes from an image by Betty G. Miller. That was an ink on paper drawing, and I used a different technique. I used ceramic. It's sort of an homage to that early work that she did as Mother of Davia, but again, depicting very traumatic experience of being denied access to sign language, which in this case was shown by the hands with the fingers being removed. Another piece is called Growing in ASL. And it is actually the sign for growth. Again, deaf people are proud of our language. And so this is a celebration of that language, actually embodied in the hands that produce the language itself. I work in many different mediums and many different techniques. In this example, I worked with a colleague Adrian Berry, and shortly after I moved to Canada we entered, of course, the time of COVID, and many people assume that deaf people can lip read as a way of communication, but actually it's extraordinarily difficult to lip read. We only can access 30% of what's being said. And now imagine that compounded by COVID and the masks which people began to wear. So this is a short animation that talks about some of the struggles of communicating via lip reading. So again, here's a fish with an animated eye. This building is a signification of my experience being raised, being forced to communicate through lip reading. The difficulty, this was one of my favorite cartoon characters, but I couldn't lip read them. So it's the challenge of that being your only mechanism to communicate with others. The words are like daggers. The speech comes out and is harmful. And as our fish being harmed by those flying words. And then the fish on their journey enters a world of water. Continues on this journey through different elements, water images, and encounters the deaf community, signified here by the fish. And a hand with an eye invites the fish into a different world, takes the fish and guides them into community, into this new world that's vibrant, that's flourishing, that's intact, that's expressive, that communicates clearly. And all of these images were taken from my portfolio of work and compiled in this animation. So my fish identity, my story, I use this fish in many different projects. It's a strong motif in Persian culture. The fish's body, conveying some of those Persian motifs and those strong, vibrant colors. This is a performance piece from 2024 that really speaks to that theme of resistance. And many deaf experiences are conveyed through what we call VV, or visual vernacular. Mm-hmm. And the visual vernacular is a way that a deaf performer conveys a narrative or an experience through body language, facial expression, not sign language, but all kinds of other physical performance. And in this case, the story was supported by projections, and some of those projections came from some of my work. These particular hand shapes depict the hand shapes that are used when producing the sign for liberation or freedom. And so in this depiction, this performance, we're really emphasizing how much is conveyed visually. The world does not rely on sound. We can access the world through a visual medium. And here I'm just going to close with some of my references, some resources that people might be interested to follow up on if they're interested in learning more about Devia. Sorry, I went a little bit over time, Famita. Should I stop my sharing my screen here?
Maybe keep the screen just in case somebody wants to see a previous artwork. But if it's okay, let's shift over to Q&A right now. And thank you so much, Maryam, for what a fantastic presentation, and for sharing all very personal anecdotes about your own experiences, but also helping us to become more deaf aware? And I think before we kick off to audience Q&A, my last question would be to you, how can we, and the many of the guests joining us today who are part of the hearing community, how can we work towards becoming more deaf aware?
My personal message to people who are interested in becoming deaf aware is to invite people to see deaf experience. Come see me at the Deaf Culture Center, meet deaf people, participate in deaf events, inquire what's happening in deaf agencies or associations or community organizations. Explore the culture. Just like you would explore any other culture, explore our culture through our art, through our people, through our community events. There are deaf organizations and festivals like 1S1 Theater, Sound Off Theater, Unify Deaf Festival. There are many places to encounter us. And when you see deaf people's experience as it's lived in our lives, our culture, our history, that's how you become deaf aware. That's how you become deaf aware, by meeting deaf people.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay. I have a question from Layla, and she said, what an outstanding presentation. Most of the comments they are just full of love for your work. I don't have time to read them all, but maybe we can share those with you afterwards. So Layla asks, your work is truly inspiring. What personal challenges and questions have you faced as a deaf artist navigating the art world more generally, primarily through your journey from Iran to Malaysia and now to Canada?
It's a good question. It is difficult to be a deaf artist. When I was growing up, I certainly experienced many barriers, much oppression. You learn to have a thick skin, you learn to be resilient. And I think, that kind of resilience comes in my life by sharing my art with the world, whether that's my experience as a woman or my experience as a deaf person. I don't know if that really gets to the question, but by that resilience and sharing art is how I navigate it.
Thank you. Now, Mahrok, our friend Mahrok, who was director of the Queen Gallery, she asks you, Maryam, how has the shift in your environment and the newfound freedom to grow on your own terms shaped your artistic journey? In what ways has it influenced the emotions, the themes, and the depth of expression in your work?
So presently, yeah. My journey artistically has depended very much on the situation and environment that I found myself in, socially and politically. And as I moved, it's really hard to describe how those environments shaped my art. It surprised even me. But I was, you know, as a deaf person, and using art to convey a deaf experience, I think I want hearing people to see us not just as people who don't hear, but people who are cultural, people who are expressive, people who have traditions, history, culture, language. And that's what I want to show. And that's what I want to use my art to show.
Another question is, your work is so inspiring, and have you done anything for children?
I'm excited to share a project with you. It's quite unique, and it's called Mother. As I became a mother, I'm more interested in motherhood. And I'm exploring the ideas of the shame that accompanies breastfeeding in public. And I think showing the naturalness and beauty of breastfeeding in public is part of what I want to talk about. Um, Also, I think just one second. So the Iranian Persian sign for mom is actually a depiction of the act of breastfeeding. And I have noticed that in in Persian language in Iran, each province has a very distinct accent in spoken language and also in sign language. So I am doing a piece that has images of women's breasts, and motifs on their bodies that depict the unique textures and designs of Persian carpets that are particular to each province. So for us, carpets are not carpets. Carpets are symbolic, and the designs are very geographically specific. And so hopefully we will be having this exhibition ready at the Deaf Culture Center in May, and exploring these ideas of cultural specificity and womanhood and mother's experience. So hopefully that will be up for Mother's Day. Another piece that I'm looking at, a project that I'm looking at, examines social barriers. And it's a sculpture that has to do with access. And again, it's using the technique of visual vernacular and a sculpture to demonstrate barriers and resistance to barriers and fights for access. So I'm not sure where that's going to be. That's something we're still working on. And another project that I'm working on will be, on my website, and also the Canadian Cultural Society of the Deaf website. You'll be able to follow what's new and upcoming in my work. Another project that I'm doing is, because I am curator at the Deaf Culture Center, I am also always on the lookout for other deaf artists whose work I can examine and explore and present to audiences at the Deaf Culture Center.
That actually is related to one of the questions is, so where can we find out about these future events? Should we visit the Deaf Culture Center website, or is there another website that we could consult?
If it's related to deaf experience, deaf arts, or DeVia, the Deaf Culture Center website is the place to go. And art. I'm always going to send people to the art.
Well, I, for one, will definitely come to the exhibition relating to breastfeeding and carpets, and I'm extremely interested in terms of as curator at the ROM to see those works. So please remember to let us know about them. I have one more question, and I think then we've come to the end. We have to end our program. It's not necessarily related to just your art itself, but it's an important question. What are some of the most challenging experiences deaf people have faced when interacting with hearing people? Or can you share some difficult or frustrating experiences that deaf people commonly face due to misunderstandings from hearing people?
Oh, well, that is a fact of our everyday lives. Much depends on the location. Sometimes, for example, as an artist, I might want to have a meeting with a gallery owner or a museum. Oh, before I do this, let me just give some background. Deaf people get frustrated when hearing people are not willing to write down what they're saying. That would be one example. So, for example, if I'm meeting with a gallery owner, then I want them to know that as a deaf artist, I need to have access to what they're saying. They need to have access to what I'm saying. So they need to provide an interpreter or have another mechanism to communicate. My first language my language now is a sign language, and the language I wish to communicate it in sign language. So an interpreter ought to be part of that communication. But not every social interaction you're going to have an interpreter. So the best thing to do is just be willing to write down what you're saying. And it's very frustrating when hearing people are reluctant to do that. And my experience, like many other deaf people's experience, and specifically deaf artists' experience, but really anywhere that we're interacting, we're often afraid to ask for an interpreter because that obligation, although it sits with those people, they don't know it. And when we have to really push for it, when we have to demand that access, we're afraid that there will be repercussions, that we may actually limit our access. But what we would like is for people to recognize that if deaf people are involved in this conversation, then access has to be a priority. And don't be afraid to ask deaf people what they need.
Agreed, agreed. Very wise, wise advice. And I know all of us have learned so much today. I will never look at a butterfly in the same way from this day forward. So thank you, Maryam, for enlightening me on so many things.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I have to close now. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to Maryam for sharing her work and her experiences with us. We look forward to staying in touch and hearing about how your work unfolds. So good afternoon, everyone, and take care.
Goodbye. Thanks for having me.